Operation Urgent Fury was a 1983 United States-led invasion of Grenada, a Caribbean island nation with a population of about 91,000, located 160 kilometers north of Venezuela, that resulted in a U.S. victory within a matter of weeks, triggered by the house arrest on 12 October 1983 and murder of the leader of the coup which had brought a revolutionary government to power for the preceding 4 years. The invasion resulted in the appointment of an interim government, followed by democratic elections in 1984. Grenada gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1974. The leftist New Deal movement, which was seen favorably by much of the Grenadian population, seized power in a coup in 1979, suspending the constitution. After a 1983 internal power struggle ended with the deposition and murder of revolutionary Prime Minister Maurice Bishop, the invasion began early on 25 October 1983, just 2 days and several hours after the bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut. The U.S. Army's Rapid Deployment Force, U.S. Marines, U.S. Army Delta Force, and U.S. Navy SEALs and other combined forces constituted the 7,600 troops from the United States, Jamaica, and members of the regional security system defeated Grenadian resistance after a low-altitude airborne assault by the 75th Rangers on Point Salines Airport on the southern end of the island, and a Marine helicopter and amphibious landing occurred on the northern end at Pearls Airfield shortly afterward. The military government of Hudson Austin was deposed and replaced by a government appointed by Governor-General Paul Scoon until elections were held in 1984. While the invasion enjoyed broad public support in the United States, and received support from some sectors in Grenada from local groups who viewed the post-coup regime as illegitimate, it was criticized by the United Kingdom and Canada. An attempted United Nations Security Council resolution, which would have condemned it as a flagrant violation of international law, was vetoed by the United States in the Security Council. The U.S. awarded more than 5,000 medals for merit and valor. The date of the invasion is now a national holiday in Grenada, called Thanksgiving Day. For many Grenadians, the Grenada Revolution died with Bishop, and so they gave thanks when the U.S. rescued them from the faction which killed Bishop. The Point Salines International Airport was renamed in honor of Prime Minister Maurice Bishop on the 65th anniversary of his birth on 29 May 2009. Hundreds of Grenadians turned out to commemorate the historical event. Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and close friend of Bishop gave the keynote speech and referred to the renaming as an act of the Grenadian people coming home to themselves. He also hoped that it will help bring closure to a chapter of denial in Grenada's history. The invasion also highlighted problematic issues with communication and coordination between the different branches of the United States military, when operating together as a joint force, contributing to investigations and sweeping changes in the form of the Goldwater-Nichols Act and other reorganizations. Background: Sir Eric Gairy had led Grenada to independence from the United Kingdom in 1974. His term in office coincided with civil strife in Grenada. The political environment was highly charged, and although Gairy, head of the Grenada United Labour Party, claimed victory in the general election of 1976, the opposition did not accept the result as legitimate. The civil strife took the form of street violence between Gairy's private army, the Mongoose Gang, and gangs organized by the New Deal movement. In the late 1970s, the NJM began planning to overthrow the government. Party members began to receive military training outside of Grenada, On 13 March 1979, while Gary was out of the country, the NJM, led by Maurice Bishop, launched an armed revolution and overthrew the government, establishing the People's Revolutionary Government. On 16 October 1983, a party faction led by Deputy Prime Minister Bernard Coard seized power. Bishop was placed under house arrest. Mass protests against the action led to Bishop's escaping detention and reasserting his authority as the head of the government. Bishop was eventually captured and murdered along with several government officials loyal to him. The army under Hudson Austin then stepped in and formed a military council to rule the country. The Governor-General, Paul Scoon, was placed under house arrest. The army announced a 4-day total curfew where anyone seen on the streets would be subject to summary execution. The Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, as well as the nations of Barbados and Jamaica, appealed to the United States for assistance. It was later reported that Grenada's Governor-General, Paul Scoon, had requested the invasion through secret diplomatic channels. Scoon was well within his rights to take this action under the reserve powers vested in the Crown. On Saturday, the 22nd of October 1983, the Deputy High Commissioner in Bridgetown, Barbados visited Grenada and reported that Sir Paul Scoon was well and did not request military intervention, either directly or indirectly. On 25 October, Grenada was invaded by the combined forces of the United States and the regional security system based in Barbados, in an operation code-named Operation Urgent Fury. The U.S. stated this was done at the request of the Prime Ministers of Barbados and Dominica, Tom Adams and Dame Eugenia Charles, respectively. Nonetheless, the invasion was highly criticized by the governments in Canada, Trinidad and Tobago, and the United Kingdom. The United Nations Security Council considered a similar resolution, which failed to pass when vetoed by the United States. Airport. The Bishop government began constructing the Point Salines International Airport with the help of Britain, Cuba, Libya, Algeria, and other nations. The airport had been first proposed by the British government in 1954, when Grenada was still a British colony. It had been designed by Canadians, underwritten by the British government, and partly built by a London firm. The U.S. government accused Grenada of constructing facilities to aid a Soviet-Cuban military build-up in the Caribbean based upon the 9,000-foot length runway, which could accommodate the largest Soviet aircraft like the N-12, N-22, and the N-124, which would enhance the Soviet and Cuban transportation of weapons to Central American insurgents and expand Soviet regional influence. Bishop's government claimed that the airport was built to accommodate commercial aircraft carrying tourists, pointing out that such jets could not land at Pearl's airstrip on the island's north end and could not be expanded because its runway abutted a mountain at one end and the ocean at the other. In 1983, then member of the United States House of Representatives Ron Dellums traveled to Grenada on a fact-finding mission. Having been invited by the country's Prime Minister, Dellums described his findings before Congress. Based on my personal observations, discussion and analysis of the new international airport under construction in Grenada, it is my conclusion that this project is specifically now and has always been for the purpose of economic development and is not for military use. It is my thought that it is absurd, patronizing, and totally unwarranted for the United States government to charge that this airport poses a military threat to the United States' national security. In March 1983, President Ronald Reagan began issuing warnings about the threat posed to the United States and the Caribbean by the Soviet-Cuban militarization of the Caribbean, as evidenced by the excessively long airplane runway being built, as well as intelligence sources indicating increased Soviet interest in the island. He said that the 9,000-foot runway and the numerous fuel storage tanks were unnecessary for commercial flights, and that evidence pointed that the airport was to become a Cuban-Soviet forward military airbase. In 2009, the airport was renamed the Maurice Bishop International Airport, after deposed Prime Minister Maurice Bishop. Invasion. The invasion commenced at 500 on 25 October 1983. American forces refueled and departed from the Grantley Adams International Airport on the nearby Caribbean island of Barbados before daybreak en route to Grenada. It was the first major operation conducted by the U.S. military since the Vietnam War. Vice Admiral Joseph Metcalf, III, Commander 2nd Fleet, was the overall commander of U.S. forces, designated Joint Task Force 120, which included elements of each military service and multiple special operations units. Fighting continued for several days and the total number of U.S. troops reached some 7,000 along with 300 troops from the OAS. The invading forces encountered about 1,500 Grenadian soldiers and about 700 Cubans. The nature of the Cuban military presence in Grenada was more complex than initially suggested. As in Angola, Ethiopia, and other nations with large contingents of Cuban troops, the line between civilians and military personnel was blurred. For example, Fidel Castro often described Cuban construction crews deployed overseas as workers and soldiers at the same time, the duality of their role being consistent with Havana's citizen-soldier tradition. According to journalist Bob Woodward in his book Veil, captured military advisors from the aforementioned countries were actually accredited diplomats and included their dependents. None took any actual part in the fighting. Other historians have asserted that most of the supposed civil technicians on Grenada were Cuban special forces and combat engineers. Official U.S. sources state that some of their opponents were well prepared and well positioned and put up stubborn resistance, to the extent that the U.S. called in 2 battalions of reinforcements on the evening of the 26th of October. The total naval and air superiority of the coalition forces, including helicopter gunships and naval gunfire support as well as members of reserve Navy SEALs, had overwhelmed the defenders. Nearly 8,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines had participated in Operation Urgent Fury along with 353 Caribbean allies of the Caribbean Peace Forces. U.S. forces sustained 19 killed and 116 wounded. Cuban forces sustained 25 killed, 59 wounded, and 638 combatants captured. Grenadian forces casualties were 45 killed and 358 wounded. At least 24 civilians were killed, 18 of whom were killed in the accidental bombing of a Grenadian mental hospital. Reaction in the United States. A month after the invasion, Time magazine described it as having broad popular support. A congressional study group concluded that the invasion had been justified, as most members felt that U.S. students at the university near a contested runway could have been taken hostage as U.S. diplomats in Iran had been 4 years previously. The group's report caused House Speaker Tip O'Neill to change his position on the issue from opposition to support. However, some members of the study group dissented from its findings. Congressman Louis Stokes, D. Ohio, stated, "Not a single American child nor single American national was in any way placed in danger or placed in a hostage situation prior to the invasion." The Congressional Black Caucus denounced the invasion and 7 Democratic congressmen, led by Ted Vice, introduced an unsuccessful resolution to impeach Ronald Reagan. In the evening of the 25th of October 1983 by telephone, on the newscast Nightline, anchor Ted Koppel spoke to medical students on Grenada who stated that they were safe and did not feel their lives were in danger. The next evening, again by telephone, medical students told Koppel how grateful they were for the invasion and the Army Rangers, which probably saved their lives. State Department officials had assured the medical students that they would be able to complete their medical school education in the United States. International reaction. By a vote of 108 in favor to 9 voting against, with 27 abstentions, the United Nations General Assembly adopted General Assembly Resolution 38/7, which deeply deplores the armed intervention in Grenada, which constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and of the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of that state. The USSR government observed that Grenada had for a long time been the object of United States threats, that the invasion violated international law, and that no small nation not to the liking of the United States would find itself safe if the aggression against Grenada was not rebuffed. The governments of some countries stated that the United States intervention was a return to their era of barbarism. The governments of other countries said the United States by its invasion had violated several treaties and conventions to which it was a party. A similar resolution was discussed in the United Nations Security Council, and although receiving widespread support, it was ultimately vetoed by the United States. President of the United States Ronald Reagan, when asked if he was concerned by the lopsided 108-9 vote in the UN General Assembly, said, "It didn't upset my breakfast at all. Grenada is part of the Commonwealth of Nations, and following the invasion, it requested help from other Commonwealth members." The invasion was opposed by the United Kingdom, Trinidad and Tobago, and Canada, among others. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher personally opposed the U.S. invasion, and the British Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe, announced to the British House of Commons on the day before the invasion that he had no knowledge of any possible U.S. intervention. At 12:30 a.m. Tuesday, the 25th of October, on the morning of the invasion, Thatcher sent a message to Reagan. "I ask you to consider this in the context of our wider East-West relations and of the fact that we will be having in the next few days to present to our Parliament and people the sighting of cruise missiles in this country. I must ask you to think most carefully about these points. I cannot conceal that I am deeply disturbed by your latest communication. You asked for my advice. I have set it out and hope that even at this late stage you will take it into account before events are irrevocable." When she telephoned Reagan 20 minutes later, he assured Thatcher that an invasion was not contemplated. Reagan later said, "She was very adamant and continued to insist that we cancel our landings on Grenada. I couldn't tell her that it had already begun." In November 2014, a recorded telephone conversation between Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher was published, which captured an apologetic Reagan discussing the invasion with Margaret Thatcher. In this conversation, Reagan expressed regret over any embarrassment caused due to U.S. actions. He also cited lack of time and concerns regarding leaks as the reason for not informing her of the invasion sooner. Thatcher expressed her comprehension for the secrecy and why he had not been more open with her, saying she had been subject to similar restrictions at the time of the Falklands invasion. The publishing of this, and other recordings, also confirmed that later presidents continued the practice of recording White House conversations after Nixon's Watergate scandal, albeit for the purpose of later assistance in transcription.